Welcome to Hochoka Podcast.
Who are the wakļáŋheža? Lakota children are called this word, which means little sacred ones. Significantly, the Indigenous have known all along what science is now proving. There is great power in the spiritual life of children. Let's explore the topic and learn more about what it means for parents and educators everywhere. Hello, Medakiepi, and welcome to Hochoka, here at the center of St. Joseph's Indian Schools campus. I'm Scott Wooster, today's Hochoka host, and I'm joined today by Dr. Damian Costello. He's a frequent guest who joins us today to give us another fresh perspective on the spiritual through an Indigenous lens. So welcome, Damian.
Good to be back, Scott.
It's great to have you here. Always is. So I kind of gave it away in the header a little bit, but I've been around Lakota kids and their families for about 30 years now, and I've heard this all along. The children are considered to be very sacred, and they're a gift from the Creator, and they hold the future of the people. What can you tell us about that from your view?
First, it's an honor just to add to your experience, right? I mean, you've been on the ground and you've been doing this work, and so what I add is just maybe a surface ripple on the depth of your experience and your knowledge. But think about, take us back to traditional ways, an oral culture, where we don't have any recording material, we don't have a written word other than winter counts. You can't record things on your cell phone. You can't record things on camera like now. Knowledge and wisdom lives in the living memory of people. And so you are very aware both of the importance of elders, people who hold the traditions and the stories, and those who are going to hold them in the future. So children are particularly sacred in Indigenous and Lakota context. I know we all have that experience of the sacredness of children, but when your future depends on their ability to take up what you hold, you cherish that, you take very good care of it. And so you notice this in the way that Lakota people and Indigenous people in general took care of children. You know, I don't know where you were raised, but in Western context, we're used to at least this ideal of strict discipline, right? There's got to be consequences for your actions, young man, young woman. And it was the opposite in Indigenous context. Children were, from our perspective, almost coddled, right? They were never punished physically, made to feel less or unworthy, or that they were somehow dirty or unclean. And you see this in the stories and the written record, people like Black Elk, who talked about how one of the important roles as an adult was to let your children make fun of you, even in sacred ceremony. You know, he talks about going to a sun dance as a kid, and they would torment the dancers by chewing up grass and throwing it at them, and the dancers just had to take it. It was understood that children needed the ability to grow and learn uninhibited by our burdens and our arbitrary standards. And I think that example draws out what is understood is that we adults are the ones who need discipline. A lot of ceremony is about asking us to do challenging things, to get outside of ourselves, to be lifted up. And children are understood to already or still be connected to the Great Spirit, to wakļáŋheža, to Tunkashila in a very deep way, so much so that Delphine Redshirt, who's an Oglala scholar, talks about how when children, their skull still hasn't hardened, right? They still have a soft spot. Tunkashila is directly connected to them, that there is a deeper spiritual link that children have with the Creator.
Right, through the fontanelle that's what we're talking about through in a scientific way. But yeah, that makes so much sense. I really like that. I also think another thought that I had as you're talking is what a shock it must have been 1890, 1900s. What a shock the boarding schools must have been to these kids and their families. You know, we've read accounts of that. We understand that very well. But there was nothing soft about those programs for those kids at that time, and so it was not in any way linked with the Indigenous way of raising kids up to that point.
Yeah, that's one of the tragedies that we live with and are growing out of, taking that seriously, inhabiting that in a very deep way. We know as parents, like, we would never let our children be taken away from us, and we would never let them experience that kind of harsh discipline, even in the best of scenarios, let alone physical sexual abuse. But to go from a context of nurturing, of being affirmed in the way we described, to that military-like discipline, made for like a very tragic encounter that we still carry with us today.
Right. And I'm working here at St. Joe's, and I have for 30 years, and we don't look anything like we looked in 1927, when the place was formed. We do a much better job, I think, of understanding that Native perspective, or that child-rearing perspective from the Native culture.
I think it's important to highlight that this is a living experiment, right? Not experiment in a way like we have no idea what we're doing, but that we St. Joseph's Indian School and places like it are trying to bring together the best of what we need for education in the 21st century and in an Indigenous context. How do we create that nurturing environment, and how do we help those along who come from away who want to serve into this environment, and how do we do this in a context where we're just becoming relatives? The wisdom and why it worked is because people were deeply connected. They lived together all the time. Education was more of an apprenticeship than going away to a external community where you had to get to know people, both school students and educators. So it's not surprising that this would be difficult, but I think there's a lot of innovative things that St. Joseph's Indian School is doing, in particular, I think, in the realm of spirituality. So here at St. Joseph's Indian School, spirituality is a very important part of the curriculum. And I should also add that we very easily juxtapose, let's say, the best of Indigenous child rearing with maybe the worst of a Western education. But in both traditions, there's a sort of a deep respect for children. I like Black Elk's great quote. He talks about, when he was talking about the Sundance and the sacred pipe, he talks about, adults should be paying attention to children because they're very close to the Great Spirit, and he will teach things to children that older people will miss. That closeness is not just something you can recognize, but it's also a way that elders learn and remember things that maybe they once knew. And Jesus himself talks about, only those who are like little children, who become like little children, will enter the kingdom of heaven. That true spiritual growth and maturity is sort of a return to a place that we naturally inhabited when we were younger.
So we support our children's capacities when they come into school. We're building their futures by teaching them language. We're teaching them math. We're making sure that they have sports. We're building in so many different areas. Do we need to do the same thing with spirituality? It's kind of a redundant question, but
absolutely. And I think that's where the new science is coming in and showing us. I think in the Western world, we inherited this educational system where, because we often didn't agree about spirituality and we had conflicts over it, and we also started to feel like, well, we can't prove it, right? Some of the claims we've made traditionally about, where did this world come from? How did it develop? We couldn't agree on that, and so it became something that we said, well, it's not important for educating our children. It's something that we bracket. And so either we don't cover it at all, or it's sort of an add-on that doesn't make sense deeply in our curriculum. And what the science is showing us is that spirituality provides really important integrative work for becoming a human being. Now, in Indigenous contexts, in one of the working groups I was in, a Yupik woman who worked in curriculum, in Yupik contexts up in Alaska, talked about, talking with the elders, what do you want your curriculum to look like for your kids? And the elder thought about it for a while and said, I want it to help them to be real human beings. And we often forget that, in Indigenous context, it's easy to look out at the world and see most beings come into the world and become who they are very quickly, right? Mm-hmm. You don't stay with your mother for all that long, maybe a couple years at most.
Right.
And human beings need a couple decades. Mm-hmm. Our education teaches us how to sit in the world, how to become fully who we are, not just the tools to sort of make a living. So the most important thing I think that spirituality adds, and this also happens in culture too, like what would be talked about culture at St. Joseph Indian School, is providing a story for a kid to find themselves within, to understand the deeper meaning of who they are, where they're coming from, and where they're going.
Yep.
Kids are going to find that no matter what.
Right.
It's going to be found in popular media. It's going to be found in movies, something like Harry Potter, which is fine. There's nothing against that. But religion, and traditionally in Indigenous context, gave the most important story for a kid to understand the issues, the challenges, and the hope of their very life. Now, I think we teased the science, and I didn't really quite get to that. Mm-hmm. One thing that is showing us, I think in your work you talk about protective factors, right, or well-being, markers of well-being. And what they're seeing is that, this is sort of unexpected, that people with sort of high, authentic spiritual engagement are much more likely to be protected from mental health issues, from depression. Mm-hmm. One figure that's thrown out there is 80% less likely to suffer from mental health issues. Mm-hmm. And one way of looking at this is that spiritual engagement is sort of the other side of the coin to certain types of depression. Now, there are certainly medical depressions, issues that we don't want to dismiss and say everybody fits into this box.
Right.
But there's a lot of depression, particularly adolescent depression, that's really about, who am I? Mm-hmm. The answers I've been given don't work. I don't fit the boxes that people tell me I should be in. And I know we've talked enough off the air that we've gone through that, and a big part of our spiritual journey is processing those feelings, discovering who you are, and believing in yourself as a person of promise, as an authentic unfolding of mystery, of pursuing that, and not being stuck in, oh, I'm a problem, or I'm a victim, or there's no meaning.
You said something that made me think about looking in a child's eyes, a baby's eyes specifically, and just being able to see that wisdom and just that spirituality center. And I think about this, that it becomes kind of a long, and the other thing you talked about is it takes a couple decades for us to form. I would say 3 decades for some of us, but but it takes a while to get there, and you have, it's a long slog, and you need something to guide you through that adolescence. How do you go from being wakÄáŋheža, this sacred person as a baby, to sometimes somebody that adults will label as a problem, or even if they don't label, but see you as a problem as a teenager because you're trying to figure out your path and trying to sort that out.
Yeah.
Can you speak to that?
Oh, little children come from the great mystery, right? And as children, they still have more direct access to that and still reveal that in who they are. But as we grow up and we learn that we need to navigate this complicated world and discover who we are, we need stories to carry us along that provide an ongoing window into that mystery. You can almost think of like a spirit twin that's walking with you and provides that window into the mystery that's around you to help you process what you're experiencing in this difficult world. And I think there's no greater example than Black Elk. Both the very difficult aspect of spirituality and depression, right? I think today, if Black Elk was walking around as a kid who had this great vision and didn't know what to do with it, he was locked in depression as he avoided it. He had been given this vision outside of ceremony. Nobody had prepared him for that. And so he didn't know what to do. And it stayed within him. And it challenged him, and he didn't know how to process that. He would be your average American teenager today. And it wasn't until he accepted that. He processed it with a medicine person and went into ceremony and recognized his calling, that he became fully who he was. The depression left. Those questions about who am I? What is my purpose? What do I do? How do I live? How do I serve? His calling was to be a healer. Kids want to serve. And these kinds of stories lift us up and give us roles to play and teach us how to give to others. That's part of our nature. So there is a lot of existential angst out there, no matter where you are, Indigenous, non-Indigenous communities. And so how does that look like where you are on the ground working with kids?
Okay, so I would talk about that in terms of a uniquely, my population here, I'll speak to that, the uniquely Lakota population, Lakota, Nakota, Dakota, and I'll talk about the Inipi ceremony because I get to be involved in that with our kids here, adolescents, because we usually take them in when they become 7th graders, when they're going through their changes. And we offer it to all of those kids. Don't push them into it, but we offer it to them. And so you'll have a lot of competing, you'll have a lot of things that compete for their attention with the spiritual ceremony. So if I said, hey, Wednesday night we're going into the sweat lodge at 7 o'clock for a couple hours, there's a preparation period, there's getting things ready, which is all part of the learning and being around it and learning to give of yourself. You might have a lot of teenage kids who are experiencing existential angst who decide to go play on their Nintendo. They want to go to the rec center and shoot hoops. They want to hang out with their girlfriend. I've heard all sorts of excuses or different things that they want to do. But what I've seen is that the ones who do come, whether it's 1 or 2 or 10 or 15 we've had in the lodge sometimes, you get something that with them that you wouldn't get any other way. As a trained counselor, as a guy who's been a counselor with kids for 30 years, I always say this. I can sit across from a kid in a square office and work to find answers, work to find something that's going to feed that kid's soul and guide them on their path. And you fail a lot. It just doesn't, those moments they come when they're supposed to. You can't force that. But you walk into or you crawl into a sweat lodge, you get down on all fours and humbly crawl in and become one with everything, and there's no light. Everything is at its very basis level. So and invite the spirits in, and the kids know it. The kids that are in there, they see what's happening. The challenge is getting them in the door. Once they come in, they're never the same. They have a connection with something that I could sit here and try to put words to in a podcast in another square room, but I can't. All I can tell you is that there's an unnameable connection, the great mystery that lights a fire in them, and hopefully, fingers crossed, guides them, on that path to make some good decisions in their life and takes away that angst that Black Elk got from his elder, from a medicine man. And I humbly say that if I can be any kind of a conduit for what they're doing, that what a great thing. I'm wakҷáŋheža, but if I'm there and for some reason that works out in their favor, hallelujah, it's the best thing that could possibly happen, right?
Yeah. And I love some of the things you brought up there, like that this is a time of great change, right? Tons of things are happening in our bodies and minds at that age. And you talked about a rite of passage. Right? Most cultures throughout the world, kids were asked to, and most times required to, undergo a very challenging experience as part of their spiritual training, right? That demands a lot out of you, that humbles you, and that also puts you at your sort of most base level, connecting with the literal earth, sort of returning you, like it talks about going back to the womb and being reborn, sort of going back to that infancy stage and reopening your eyes.
Yeah.
And I think, it's a struggle, I'm sure. I think most of us, and it feels right at this moment, to sort of give kids the freedom to choose, but maybe we need to do a better job encouraging for them to give them better motivation or better reasoning to take seriously the effect that kind of experience has, that sort of integrative experience. We've lost our rite of passages.
Yeah.
And if you look at a lot of the risk-taking behavior that people take, adolescence but beyond, it's a search for that kind of challenge, I think. We're not challenged in a culturally informed communal context, so we go out and find it and put ourselves at great risk with much less benefit.
Yeah, I agree. So when I was a kid, I've talked to you about this before, but I was a very strong Catholic growing up. My parents took me to Mass all the time, and I have to say that I was buoyed by that when I was an adolescent. It was a big part of my belief was strong. I was kind of told this is what I had to believe, and this is the way it's going to be. It's just the way I was nurtured as a kid. I think one parallel that I draw is the storytelling is the same. If you have a good story, a compelling story, it's going to draw you in. And as a kid, hearing the stories from the Bible, hearing the stories in church, reading the Bible, those stories are amazing. They're just knockout stories, and they were for me as a kid. So by the time I got to be a teenager, that's what was lifting me up. And so in one form or another, I've kind of had that for myself, which has been very nice. But I think, and I talked about the Lakota piece of it with an EP for the kids here on campus, but we're a Catholic school too. So how does that come into play? How do we do the stories with them, and how do we nurture that from, wakļáŋheža all the way up?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think part of the problem is we're not telling the stories like we should. And the way maybe we did, and the way we could. Like when you read Moses in the Exodus story, right? The young Israelite boy who was raised as an Egyptian, who kills an Egyptian for beating an Israeli slave, and then escaping out into the desert and encountering God on the mountaintop and receiving all these ceremonies. That's as good a story as you ever heard. And if you took out all the sort of cultural details that and put it in a generic Indigenous context, you'd say, well, it's a great Indigenous story. So I think we have to tell our stories better and be more confident in them. We're so used to pulling out abstract points you must believe that we're not giving the story to the same depth. And I think also it's quite amazing when you look at particularly the life of Jesus, but a lot of the saints too, how much of the Lakota stuff is in it. So people across the globe, they read about the Vision Quest and they're like, wow, that's amazing. I'd love to do something like that. Or they think it's the epitome of a spiritual practice. And I kind of think that. Jesus did that too. He went out into the desert. In fact, there's a book by an Episcopalian bishop called The 4 Vision Quests of Jesus, who looks at the 4 different parts of his life, including his time in the wilderness, as Indigenous ceremonies. Scott, I don't know if they say this at your Sundance, but I've heard from non-Christian people, Jesus was the first Sundancer. Because if you look, and we've talked about this here, if you look at his passion, he gives his flesh so that the people may live. It's an incredible story of spiritual suffering and the healing that comes out of it, not just for him or the people, but the entire cosmos.
Right.
So I think getting better at finding those parallels and helping the kids and us to feel them. Those of us who have experienced Lakota or Indigenous spirituality, we know what those spiritual practices feel like. That's part of the church. And letting ourselves be fed by what's already there. Yeah.
And trusting kids to know what to do with that kind of information and be guided in a soft way. Maybe that's what we learn from the Indigenous way of nurturing, is to give those stories, nurture that. I think about where I might have gotten lost eventually after being raised in that way and being, like I said, buoyed by it as a teenager. I think the dogma of it, at some point scared me off. But I think trusting that people are going to do the right things with that. The kids are going to do the right thing with the stories if the story's told well enough. The passion. I mean, come on. These are stories that we know what to do with those. They resonate without having a rule that has to go with it or somebody telling us, this is the way it is. I think we understand that without needing all that.
And that speaks to, I think, sort of deep insecurity. I don't know about you, but I know when I'm trying to get my kids to do something and being really forceful about it, it's because I'm very insecure about what's happening. You look at the great spiritual people across the globe, whether it's in the Indigenous or non-Indigenous context, I've always found the most spiritual people have the kind of trust you're talking about. They trust the power of the spirits. They trust the power of the stories and the ceremonies. They know they don't have to enforce anything. It may not stick immediately, but they're going to work. And it's those of us who don't believe it think we have to force it. And so I think to get back to wakļáŋheža, the little sacred ones, and that sort of generous, open, soft approach, relational approach to children, that's what we have to get back to. In a way that gives them a framework, gives them boundaries, but most importantly, gives them love. I love it. And don't meddle. And remember that we're learning as much as we are teaching. That's just that humble approach. Good stuff. I appreciate it. I appreciate the talk. This is fun to talk about kids. This is our, this is where we want to go. So I appreciate having you on the show again today. And I look forward to the next time.
Absolutely. Okay. We'll see you soon. And to our audience, thank you so much for joining us here at wakļáŋheža at the center of St. Joseph's Indian Schools campus, where we talk about issues that are central to Native American education today. Until next time, stay centered.